This is the Global News Podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Jackie Leonard, and at 14 hours GMT on Thursday, the 20th of December, these are our main stories. Donald Trump has been defending his decision to pull US troops out of Syria, saying they shouldn't have to fight Russia, Iran and Syria's local battle against Islamic State militants. The Danish intelligence agency has authenticated a video that shows Islamist militants murdering 2 Scandinavian women on holiday in Morocco. And British police say operations at Gatwick, one of Europe's busiest airports, have been deliberately disrupted by unidentified drones flying over the airfield. Also in this podcast,
the market for rare and vintage whiskies is big and getting bigger.
But scientists have found that more than a third of bottles of rare Scottish whiskies were fake. They'll be buried in the ditches they dug, the threat issued by the Turkish defence minister to Kurdish fighters in northern Syria. There's long been conflict between Turkey and various Kurdish groups which are seeking greater autonomy, and while YPG fighters have had US support for their fight against the IS group in Syria, Turkey regards the YPG as a terrorist organisation. President Trump has defended his surprise decision announced on Wednesday that he intends to withdraw all US troops from Syria. Our correspondent in Turkey, Mark Lowen, says that decision will make a big difference.
It's removed the buffer that there was, and there has been until this point, between Turkey and the Kurdish fighters in Syria, which Turkey sees as terrorists. So Turkey was reluctant to go in and was warned against going in militarily across the border against the YPG, the Kurdish fighters, until now, because the US soldiers are on the ground there. If Donald Trump follows through, and it seems he will, with his decision to pull out the 2,000 or so US troops in Syria, well, then that will leave the YPG extremely exposed, and it makes the chance of a cross-border military incursion very, very likely now.
The YPG were felt to be very effective indeed against IS in Syria. Presumably now there must be concerns that IS will be able to recover.
Yeah, I mean, there are those concerns. And you know, even though Donald Trump has basically said mission accomplished, it is not mission accomplished. Yes, IS has lost almost all of the territory that it held until now. I mean, it held 4 years ago a territory the size of Britain. Now it is just in one area to the east of Syria and then a couple of other little pockets. That said, there are still an estimated between 20 and 30,000 IS fighters on the ground, and of course the ideology that fed and that led to the Islamic State is still there in a country as destroyed as Syria. So the fear is that if the US pulls out its troops prematurely, it could lead IS, or the remnants of IS, to morph into another group and indeed allow them to retake ground that they have lost over the last 4 years.
That was Mark Lowen in Turkey. Danish intelligence services say they've authenticated a video showing the murder of one of 2 Scandinavian women tourists in Morocco. Gent Slimani reports.
The bodies of the tourists, one from Denmark and the other from Norway, were found on Monday in a tent near a village in the High Atlas Mountains. The area where they'd been camping is popular with hikers and climbers, particularly from Scandinavia. Now, the Danish intelligence services say that the evidence, collected in cooperation with the Moroccan authorities, indicates that Islamist militants may be behind the killings. Police in Morocco say they have arrested 3 more suspects in connection with the murder. They had already detained a man who they said was a member of a militant group.
Gent Slimani. In Moscow, the Russian President Vladimir Putin has been holding his annual end-of-year news conference. Over several hours, he took questions on a range of topics, including IS in Syria, Russian activities in Ukraine, the Skripal poisoning here in the UK, and the risk of nuclear war. When asked about the possibility of a nuclear arms race, Mr. Putin said Russia would respond to Washington's withdrawal from arms treaties.
We are seeing the collapse of the international system of arms control. After the US withdrew from the Treaty on Missile Defense, which is the cornerstone of ending the arms race, we were forced to respond by creating a new type of weapon to overcome missile defense systems. Now we hear that Russia has the advantage. Yes, that's true. Other countries don't have such weapon systems yet, but they'll develop them.
Yuri Vendik from the BBC Russian service was listening.
We don't hear much of anything new from them. I've been to quite a number of them before, and the Putin usually uses them as a opportunity to show that everything is control and the country is faring well, and so on and so on. But some of the journalists just use these press conferences as an opportunity to better understand the way Putin thinks and the way he acts correspondingly. And these questions, like Skripal's, and the answers to them were quite telling and colorful, I would say, that because answering to the question about Skripal's, he said that this was just a pretext for a Russophobic attack on Russia, for another Russophobic attack on Russia. Asked about Ukraine, he said that there are Russophobic people at power in Kiev, and they've been paid by the West to uphold the conflict with Russia. So that's quite telling.
You say that these events, they go on for hours and hours and hours. How much stage managing is there? Are there any surprises to come out of these events usually?
They are half stage, I would say, because the questions, probably a third of the questions or so, they are the right to ask a question have always been given to the journalist that the press secretary knows. Journalists obviously working with them or famous otherwise. And the questions are prepared and the Putin are prepared to answer them. But there are quite a lot of questions, quite at random, given to all kinds of journalists, liberal Russian journalists, Western and so on and so on. But the problem is not the questions, the problem is the answers.
Yuri Vendik from the BBC Russian service. As we record this podcast, there is massive disruption at Britain's second busiest airport, Gatwick, near London, which remains closed due to the dangers posed by drones flying near the runway. The airport's chief operating officer is Chris Woodruff.
There are 110,000 passengers due to fly today, and the vast majority of them will see cancellations and disruption. It is clearly our intention to get open again, but only when it is safe to do so, and I cannot tell you what time we will open.
Many of the passengers who are now stranded are very anxious.
I think it can be very dangerous to think of a drone in flight.
We really don't want to be here for Christmas, so we better be able to fly. We'd be very angry.
The actual check-in lounges is awful. I mean, Turkish Airlines, the queue was to the end of the airport. I saw women crying. Someone had collapsed at the bottom of the escalator. It's just an absolute shambles.
Superintendent Justin Burtonshaw is in charge of policing at the airport.
We're still getting sightings of the drone in and around the airfield. I've got over 20 units from Surrey and Sussex and from the airport searching for the drone operator to try and locate him. Each time we believe we get close to the operator, the drone disappears. When we look to reopen the airfield, the drone reappears. So I'm absolutely convinced it's a deliberate act to disrupt Gatwick Airport.
Is this a problem you've had at Gatwick before?
There's been an incident or two, but only very minor ones, where there's been a sighting and that's been negated or confirmed and that person's been dealt with, and the airport's reopened. Nothing like this to this extent.
Chris Fox, our technology correspondent, told us about the rules regarding drones near airports.
In the UK here, like many other countries, you're not supposed to fly your drone more than 400 feet in the air, so about 200 metres or so. There are prohibited zones. You're not supposed to fly anywhere near an airport within 1 kilometre or about a mile here in the UK. And that compares with countries including US, China, France. Most countries have some sort of regulation in place. In about 15 countries, drones are banned completely. You can't fly them at all in Saudi Arabia, in Syria, in Iraq. And we do see a lot of videos coming out of Syria where people have flown a drone over war zones, but you're not really supposed to fly them there. And travel experts say they might even be confiscated at customs if you arrive in one of those countries with a drone.
We heard from Gatwick that they've not seen anything like this before. We do hear from time to time about near misses with drones, don't we? Has anything like this happened before?
Certainly drones appearing at airports has happened before. Usually they've only been shut down for maybe half an hour. It happened in Manchester in the north of England. It's happened before. But this does feel like something that's longer, and battery life on a drone is usually about half an hour flying. So it suggests that the batteries are either being topped up if it's constantly flying. Perhaps there's more than one drone, and maybe they're being flown from far away. You can program a drone to use GPS satellite signals to go on a predetermined course and then go back to base. So the drone operator might not be anywhere near the area.
So what sort of technical measures can be employed to stop this sort of thing?
Well, there's a few things, as from practical to Star Wars. You can do something called geofencing, which manufacturers can tell the drone where it's not allowed to fly, and if it detects that it's in with one of those areas, it can be forced to land. Although if you were a criminal, you could overcome that quite easily. There's radio jamming, where you can block the signals, so to stop someone using a wireless controller to control their drone, you can block that. But again, if you're a criminal, you could just set it on a predetermined path. And then the more extreme option is using a laser. We've seen companies like Boeing testing this, where they use a high-powered laser to track the drone and set the battery on fire, causing it to crash.
That was Chris Fox. Japanese media reports say the country intends to resume commercial whaling. Our Asia-Pacific editor Michael Bristow told us more.
There's been no official report from the Japanese government yet, but what they're saying in these reports is that Japan intends to withdraw from the International Whaling Commission's ban on commercial whaling sometime in the next couple of weeks. In some respects, people might think, why does that matter? Because Japan for the last 3 decades has been catching whales under what many people call a loophole in the regulations, which allow certain countries to catch whales for scientific research. Many people claim Japan isn't doing any scientific research. It's just essentially catching these whales to sell for people to eat. But it would be a major step if Japan did say it was commercially starting to catch whales again, and goes against what effectively has been a ban since 1982.
Just how popular is whale meat? Has whale meat traditionally been in Japan?
It's an interesting question, this, because you would imagine Japan is well known for being a nation where they eat lots of seafood. But in actual fact, whale meat is not very popular. It was after the war. The Americans encouraged the Japanese to actually go commercially hunting whales in order to feed a population still trying to recover from the war. But since Japan has become a lot richer, whale meat has just fallen off the menu. Many people think Japan is doing this partly out of bloody-mindedness, in that the rest of the world is telling them to stop. They don't want to stop. And also, there's a lot of politicians with a vested interest in supporting commercial whaling communities, and they're pushing towards getting Japan to return to commercial whaling too.
That was Michael Bristow. Still to come in this podcast.
My Y chromosome didn't match my own brother. So that told me my father wasn't my father, and my brother was merely a half-brother.
The dangers of using an over-the-counter DNA testing kit. Figures out today in Britain show a sharp increase in the numbers of homeless people dying on the streets. In England and Wales, there's been a rise of nearly a quarter in the last 5 years. Risha Lancaster's brother, Craig, died sleeping rough in 2013. She isn't surprised by the figures.
I think it's shocking, and we're in a humanitarian crisis at this minute in time, and so much more needs to be done. But no, I'm not surprised, because I work 7 days a week with people who are homeless, and we've had so many deaths in Manchester that no, the figures don't surprise me at all.
Charlotte Gallagher has been looking at the numbers for us.
It's an absolutely shocking figure. 597 homeless people died in England and Wales in 2017. That's a rise of 24% over 5 years. It was mainly men. 84% of the people who died were men. The average age is startling, 44 for a man and 42 for a woman. When you compare that to the general population, the average age for a man to die here is 76. The average age for a woman to die is 82. So they're actually living half as long, the women on the streets, as women who are living in homes. The causes, they say, mainly drug overdoses, liver disease and suicide as well. Now, London, not surprisingly, has the worst problem. 136 people died here last year. I mean, only this week, a man collapsed and died outside the Houses of Parliament. And that's not the first time that that's happened in that particular location. I mean, you will know, Jackie, living and working in London, the problem has got worse. You can't deny it. I mean, there's a church outside the BBC building. There's about 7 people sleeping outside that church every night, sometimes more, some of them in tents, others, under cardboard in the coldest and wettest of conditions. So it really is a problem that isn't going away.
It is shocking. It is visible. What does the government say?
They've said it's totally unacceptable. They say they're investing $1.5 billion to tackle homelessness. They say they want to halve rough sleeping by 2022 and end it by 2027. The opposition parties are saying there needs to be a lot more money and a lot more focus.
That was Charlotte Gallagher. Up to 100,000 taxi drivers in South Korea have gone on strike against plans by the country's main messenger service, Kakao, to introduce a carpooling service. The one-day nationwide protest, the third such demonstration since October, was prompted after a taxi driver set himself on fire earlier this month. Laura Bicker reports from Seoul.
It's thought around half of all taxi drivers in South Korea have gone on strike. They are furious at the launch of a new carpooling service by the technology giant Kakao, which will allow drivers with private vehicles to act as taxis during peak hours. Similar protests were held in 2015 when Uber tried and failed to launch its app in South Korea. Kakao has said it is willing to talk to taxi unions, and the government has given permission for the service to go ahead. Drivers will hope their demonstration will make both think again.
That was Laura Bicker in South Korea. Now, it might be something that transcends politics in other countries, but in the United States, climate change is still a highly divisive issue. According to new research, more than 80% of Democrats say they've now seen enough evidence to warrant action on climate change. The majority of Republicans, though, say they don't believe that. So how hard is it, as a Republican, particularly with a climate change sceptic in the White House, to go green? Aleem Makboul has been to meet one man who's been trying just that.
So here we are in Georgetown, Texas, on the most beautiful town square, not only in Texas, but the United States of America, I tell you.
Dale Ross is the mayor of this town. I meet him in the evening with the town centre quite literally glowing, with its trees and buildings covered in Christmas lights, something for which the town has become famous.
Oh, just look at this. This is like a winter wonderland. This is sort of what heaven would look like at Christmas.
For an environmentalist, it doesn't look like heaven, does it? It looks like it's a huge waste of energy. What's going on?
It's not, because we are 100% renewable energy, so all of these wonderful lights, the whole downtown experience is funded by wind and solar energy.
Yes, the town has become the largest in the US to switch solely to renewable energy companies. A wind farm and a huge solar park in West Texas supplying its power, and all under the watch of Mayor Ross. But as a Republican from Texas, he's an unlikely climate change superhero at a time when his party and the president have been frustrating and dismaying environmentalists.
Yes, me and Mr. Trump are from the same party, but we couldn't differ more on environmental policies. And I tell you what, I'll leave the science to the subject matter experts. And we're not leading on this issue, and it's because we have a president playing politics with this issue instead of looking at the facts in an objective way.
But Georgetown is a conservative place, and what's happened here is even more surprising when you find the majority of people here did vote for Donald Trump.
The United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord.
So who are the people who would applaud such a statement by the president in the Rose Garden of the White House? Well, obviously the same types of people who've started a campaign against Mayor Ross and what he's trying to do in Texas.
What's good for Texans is going to be having the lights on and having a reliable source of power. If the most reliable source of power was wind and solar, great. We'd love that. That's not the case presently.
Cata Gonzalez is from a group that, far from celebrating Georgetown's achievements, has become the mayor's biggest and most public critic. Except the group, the Texas Public Policy Foundation, is the state's biggest Republican think tank. They focus on the subsidies given to the renewable energy industry, neglecting to mention the massive subsidies given to the oil industry, and say the mayor's disrespecting the heritage of the state and the country by demonizing fossil fuels.
'Tis the season to be jolly, fa la 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 la.
But back in Georgetown's Christmassy, renewable energy-powered, lit-up square, Mayor Ross says that in spite of how difficult the politics makes it to be a conservative and still care about the environment, and the pressure from the powerful energy lobbies, it's still possible to make change.
That was Aleem Makboul in Texas. And a very popular Christmas present in the USA is an over-the-counter genetic testing kit. Until recently, it was far too expensive for people to analyse their own DNA. But today, for just $99, you can find out what diseases you might be prone to and explore your family tree. All you have to do is spit into a tube or swab the inside of your cheek and drop your sample in the mail. But what happens when you get unexpected, possibly unwelcome results? Lucy Ash looks at the emotional fallout.
This is Nightly Business Report.
Busy week. Earnings arrive in force. Expectations are high.
TV journalist Bill Griffith keeps an eagle eye on stocks and shares, but he's also an expert on his family tree. The 62-year-old from New Jersey spent years scrutinising records and documents to learn about his ancestors and wanted to find out more by taking a DNA test. The results, though, were a bit surprising when compared to those of his first cousin. So he asked his older brother Chuck to also send a sample to the lab.
So he did. My Y chromosome didn't match my own brother. So that told me my father wasn't my father, and my brother was merely a half-brother. And I got to say, that was devastating. The DNA had spoken.
So had his mum been unfaithful to his dad, the idea seemed preposterous.
The last thing we would believe about my sainted mother was that she had strayed. She was the classic church lady.
Finally, Bill plucked up the courage to phone his 95-year-old mum, Frances. Now a widow, she lived 3,000 miles away in an assisted living complex in California.
So I said to her, I took this DNA test, and I got a weird result. And I paused, and she didn't say anything. There was silence on the other line. Then I could hear soft sobbing, and I panicked. I thought, oh my God, what have I done?
She reluctantly admitted that his father was her former boss who ran a construction company. Frances lived another 5 years, but Bill says their relationship was never the same again.
I think she was hoping mightily that she could slip out the back door at the end of her life without this becoming revealed.
Half a century ago, who could have imagined a world of $99 DNA kits, a world in which a swift analysis of saliva would drag so many skeletons out of the closet? Bill is thankful the man who raised him had died long before the earth-shattering DNA revelations. What happens, though, when spitting into a tube exposes cheating in a more recent marriage?
When my daughter said that we'd bought the DNA kit, my wife looked like she'd got hit by a truck.
I'm calling this man Lawrence, and his words are spoken by an actor to protect his family's identity. The test results showed his 15-year-old daughter shared no genetic material with him, and his wife was finally forced to come clean.
She turned white. She just had this, horrible look on her face, like when somebody's caught stealing something.
Lawrence filed for divorce, but told the child he raised as his own that he loved her and that she could contact her biological dad with his blessing. But how did his son, the younger child, who does share his genes, react?
He blamed his sister for the divorce. He would say, "It's because of you our parents split up," and I would put a stop to that real quick. I'm telling him she's innocent. She had no say in this. It is your mother and what she did that caused the divorce, not what your sister did by being born.
In some cases, the fallout from DNA testing is ripping families apart. You might buy a loved one a DNA kit this Christmas, but be careful what you wish for.
That report by Lucy Ash. Scientists who have carried out a lengthy study of rare Scottish whiskies have found that more than a third of the bottles tested were fake. One wasn't whisky at all. From Glasgow, here's James Shaw.
The market for rare and vintage whiskies is big and getting bigger. Earlier this year, a bottle of Macallan with unique artwork sold for £848,000, which means there is a growing incentive for unscrupulous sellers to introduce fakes onto the market. Scientists at the Scottish University's Environmental Research Centre found that all the early whiskies they tested, which were supposed to be from around 1900 or before, were not what they claimed to be.
James Shaw in Scotland. And that's it from us for now. I'm off to conduct an in-depth testing of a nice single malt, but there will be an updated version of the Global News podcast later. If you would like to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, do please send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. I'm Jackie Leonard, and until next time, goodbye.